So in this shoebox, I've got kind of two mementos that I've got of my mother and my father, both of which I discovered after they'd both passed away. So the first one, all wrapped up in tissue paper, is a piece of material. It's sort of got a square kind of pattern on it, which my father weaved and gave it to my mother.
Zoe Reed has had an impressive career as a public service manager in the UK and has dedicated nearly half a century to helping others. She's been chair of SACU, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, since 2009. But Zoe also has an extraordinary personal story. After believing her father was dead throughout her childhood, she discovered he was very much alive and met him for the first time in Beijing in her mid-40s. This event, along with her serendipitous lifelong connection to Joseph Needham, one of the most important bridge-building Westerners in China's 20th century, changed the trajectory of Zoe's life forever. Now a septuagenarian, Zoe remains more committed than ever to enhancing relations between China and the UK.
And then the other package that I've wrapped up is of a beautiful, intricate V-necked vest, I think we'd call it now. It smells very strongly of Chinese mothballs, and apparently my mother had knitted it for my father when he'd been with her in UK. So it's an amazing pair of mementos of obviously what my father meant to my mother and my mother meant to my father.
So how did it all begin?
I was born on the 21st of March 1951, and I was born to a single mum who was living in a mother and baby home at the time. And the reason for that was because she had become pregnant with a Chinese man who had in fact returned back to China. As you can imagine, in those days in 1951 there was a lot of intolerance, not a lot of favour for half-caste children, and so my mother was on her own and having to carve a life for both of us.
Zoe's mum, Susan, was unwell at the time of her birth and had to spend a month in hospital.
She initially didn't want anything to do with me, and she put it down to the obstetrician, the young man who was helping her through the birth, that he apparently cradled me in his arms and said, "Oh, you're a beautiful little thing, aren't you? Lovely, aren't you?" And eventually my mother said, "All right, hand her over." And then, of course, my mother fell in love with me.
From the moment Zoe entered the world, according to her mother, they were shunned by her grandparents and other family members because of her mixed heritage.
The story she told me was that my grandmother and grandfather arrived in the hospital, saw me looking half Chinese, and said, "You know, this can't possibly have a half Chinese child." My mother said, "She is my daughter, I'm keeping her." And that my grandmother said, "Come, Ernest," that was my grandfather's name, "this is no daughter of ours," and marched out of the hospital. My mother then never saw any family members till I was about 11.
Alone and needing to pay the bills, Susan was forced to lead an itinerant lifestyle during Zoe's early childhood. She worked for a number of small residential children's homes which could accommodate both of them. Zoe recalls those years as being very lonely. She remembers playing on her own while her mum worked and attending different schools. But even at that young age, Zoe was very pragmatic and accepting. She understood that her mum was simply doing what she needed to do. And most importantly, there was never a shortage of love or tender care. When Zoe was 7, Susan then decided to fulfill a lifelong ambition and become a nurse. And this decision brought with it a great deal of change for Zoe.
And so I had a series of what now would be called informal foster care. I suppose the strongest one I lived with was her friends called Lanny and Peter, who had quite a sort of a strict but loving relationship with me, and I liked my time with them.
So what about Zoe's father? How did he and Susan meet? Well, it was in fact due to a series of remarkable events involving Joseph Needham, a Cambridge professor. Here's his biographer, Simon Winchester.
Joseph Needham was an extraordinary, and I venture to say a polymath. He knew an immense amount about everything. He trained initially as a biochemist at Cambridge, and having a pretty good working knowledge of the Chinese language, he was offered by the British government during the war a job of going to China and helping Chinese universities that had largely moved into the west of the country to get away from the Japanese invasion. And during that period, he developed this fascination with what the Chinese had created over the centuries of their civilized existence. And he wrote a long book. He began work in 1948 on a book about this phenomenon, which by the time he died in 1995, had expanded to something like 25 volumes, 4.5 million words, called Science and Civilization in China.
In 1943, while Joseph Needham was travelling from Chongqing to Duhuang, he was joined by New Zealand-born writer and political activist Ravi Ali and a couple of Chinese school students who helped to do the cooking and cleaning. And one of them, Sun Guangcheng, who friends referred to him as KC. The group really gelled, so as a token of his gratitude, Joseph decided to bring KC and his fellow student to the UK for technical training. This was to be the beginning of a lifelong friendship, not just with KC, but with Susan and Zoe. KC studied textile engineering in Nottingham and became the first ever mature Chinese student funded by British United Aid to China. Around this time, Zoe's mother Susan entered an essay competition on international relations. To her absolute surprise and delight, she won. Her prize was a place at Stanford Cooperative College in Nottinghamshire, where Casey was also living and studying.
So she arrived there and there were 100 men, 3 women, and 2 of the women were lesbians. So she had pretty good choice of which young man to fall in love with, and told me it was a chap from Iceland she quite liked, but it was my father from China who they fell in love, and by all intents a strong romance together.
The relationship between Susan and Casey lasted for 2 years. In 1950, he had to return to China, not knowing that Susan was carrying his child. Unsure what to do next, Susan wrote a letter to Joseph Needham asking him for advice, even though she'd never met him before.
Dear Dr. Needham, I wonder if you can or would help me. You do not, of course, know me, but by way of introduction, I can say that I am the Susan Reed that Sun Guangcheng talked of marrying a couple of years ago. Needless to say, we both thought better of it, but I now find myself in the quite terrible situation of going to have his child in March. I understand from Mrs. Atherton of Holywell that he's returned to China, although I've actually not seen Sun Guangcheng for 4 months at least. I have been working since June in the children's home near Holywell. I would not have bothered you now, as I realise all of this has come about entirely through my own fault, were it not for the fact that I have run into considerably more trouble than I had bargained for.
He and his wife Dorothy invited her to stay for the weekend to discuss the different options. They even explored the idea of having Zoe adopted, but were met with lots of rejections.
Dear Mr. Needham, thank you for your letter received yesterday, written on behalf of an acquaintance.
And wish to help the young unmarried woman, but it would ordinarily be more difficult in this country to find a suitable family willing to adopt a half-Chinese baby than if the child had been entirely...
We very much regret that we're unable to help this girl, as we have no adopters who are willing to consider a child of Chinese parentage.
Choose the kind of child they believe their own would have been. A half-Chinese child will obviously look rather different from a European, and it would be a matter of
The only suggestion that we can make is that you might apply to the League of Coloured Peoples.
When time comes, I'm sure we would try to assist this expectant mother, but our success would depend upon whether a suitable family should apply.
Shortly after her visit, Susan had a change of heart. She sent the Needhams this letter.
Dear Dophy and Joseph, I'm terribly sorry, but I've fallen in love with her, so I'm not going to let her be adopted. I'm going to keep her.
Throughout Zoe's childhood and teenage years, Zoe's father had never been mentioned. She'd invented a story about him dying of smallpox, and her mother wore a wedding ring so that people wouldn't ask questions and assume that she was a widow.
I remember nobody ever spoke about my father. In fact, what I was told was that he was dead. That was kind of easier way of handling the lack of connection, and it made sense, and it meant the aunties and uncles and the various schools I went to, my Chineseness was ignored. It was not really part of the story.
It wasn't until Zoe was at college that her mother revealed that her father might not be dead after all and could still be living in China. Susan had sent a few letters when Zoe was a child, but he'd never responded. They both realised that the only person who might be able to help was Joseph Needham. As it turned out, he wasn't able to help, but from that point on, Zoe always believed that her father was alive and that she would find him.
I always thought he was alive, and I thought he was alive in China, and I thought, I'm going to get to see him. So it was a sort of curious certainty in me that I thought, no, he's going to be in China, an opportunity for me to then connect with China, whereas up until then I'd completely suppressed it.
Zoe and her mother remained close to Joseph Needham throughout their lives, and interestingly, in the last few years of his life, Susan also looked after him. After Joseph Needham died in 1995, Zoe attended the memorial service and met H.G. Huang, who had been Needham's secretary during his trip to China in 1943. He said he'd help her find her father. Huang wrote to Casey's old teacher in China, and she, in turn, contacted Zoe's father. Zoe's niece Juan, who lives in Lanzhou, was a child at the time and remembers this moment very well.
When Joseph Needham passed away, there is a news report on the TV. My grandfather told me Joseph Needham is teacher. At that time, I don't believe it, because Joseph Needham is too famous. Then some months later, my grandfather's friend told him he has a daughter in the UK. We really think we need to know her, to meet her, because she is a family member.
As soon as he knew of his daughter's existence, Juan also recalls KC, Zoe's dad, writing a lot of letters to her. They didn't have emails at the time, but he wanted to tell her more about his life and share family stories.
When my grandfather was retired at that time, I still remember my grandfather really wrote a lot of letters and stories to Zoe.
Zoe vividly remembers the first letter she received from her father, and to this day, she feels emotional hearing it.
My dearest daughter Zoe, how are you? How is your family? I miss you very much. Time is flying by like an arrow. The days and months are rushing by. Zoe, suddenly 46 years have gone, and we live far apart from each other. We are not able to meet, and it makes my heart heavy. Even though I was not there to raise you, and though you and your mother have had such a long, difficult life, you still miss me, and this makes me very emotional. Me and your Chinese mother will try all our efforts to make up for these 46 lost years. Zoe, a million words cannot express my love for you. We may be far apart, but hopefully we can soon see each other. I wish your whole family well, and that your work is going well. Love from your father, Kim, and your mother, Gang Yun, with kisses.
A year later, along with her husband Richard and 2 children, Zoe decided to fly to Beijing to meet her father for the first time. Casey, his wife, daughter, son-in-law and granddaughter Juan had travelled for 36 hours by train from Lanzhou for the momentous meeting.
I met my father for the first time in Tiananmen Square underneath the red flag on my 46th birthday. And this was my husband's great idea. Don't just meet him in a hotel lobby, do it somewhere significant. And so at about 2:45, we decided to walk towards the flag. And then, of course, we saw across Tiananmen Square this group of Chinese people also walking towards the flag. So that was just a phenomenal sensation, really, to see them all and meet them all. That sudden realization that I'm connected to all these people in China and through this man, and also having a father for the first time. Not sure what that meant, having survived quite happily, thank you, without one for so long. But just that weird sense of connection into another culture.
Zoe's niece Juan, who was only 11 years old at the time, will never forget the moment that she saw her aunt for the first time.
First time I saw her, I think she is my aunt. And even I thought she is a Chinese. She has black hair and really looks like my grandfather.
After spending time with Casey, Zoe recalls feeling a connection to him, but it took a while before she felt able to call him father. Although her dad deeply regretted the 46 years that they'd missed out on, Zoe tried to reassure him and told him that she understood.
We spent time together. I felt very warm with him. When I first met him, he was feeling guilty. Oh, I should have been a father to you and I should have stayed in UK. I mean, I always said, knowing my mother as I knew her, they'd have probably been divorced after a couple of years anyway. You know, she'd have struggled, I think, to maintain that relationship. And it would have been a terrible time in UK. He'd have suffered racism, he'd have suffered all sorts of difficulties. But most importantly, I wouldn't have had this nice Chinese family to connect to. He was always very committed to building a new China. And that was, he came to the West to learn skills, wanted to take them back to build a new China. And that's what he did, and remained committed to China to the end, just as I'm committed to UK.
After that initial visit to Beijing, Zoe was fortunate enough to make 4 further visits to see her father before he died, just before the Beijing Olympics in 2008. She feels immensely grateful to have been able to piece together some of his fascinating life during those trips, and also through their correspondence. She has remained in close contact with her Chinese family, in particular with her niece Juan, her husband Zhou Yi, and their 7-year-old daughter Yu Yu. Juan told me she really misses Zoe, even though they chat often. She says her aunt never forgets birthdays or special days and never ceases to inspire her.
I think Zoe is my closest family in the world. And it really makes me to feel very warm. Zoe, she's my aunt. And in Chinese thinking way, we also think she's my mom. I really love her.
As for her relationship with her mum, Zoe describes it as complex in later years. She always felt a strong bond with her, also a keen sense of responsibility. But they lived over 300 miles apart, with her mother in Barrow-in-Furness and Zoe in London. And although her mother was becoming increasingly frail, she was refusing offers of help, and Zoe didn't know what to do.
She was, as I say, fiercely independent. She couldn't work out. I remember talking to an eminent theorist about her, and he says there's a difference between loneliness and being alone. And I like to think that my mother was alone and liked to be alone.
Then in 2005, Zoe's mum passed away in her own home. As a mum to grown-up children, Kate and Simon herself, I asked Zoe what impact her own childhood had had on her. Although Zoe has always juggled work with a busy career and wasn't one of the mums at the school gate, she wanted to give them stability that she'd always craved herself as a child.
Well, I think my childhood and my experience with my mother meant that I wanted to create a life with my lovely husband, Richard, of stability and security for my children. So we've always lived in the same house, and it's this house now that Kate's come back to live in with her husband and son. So Kate and I have an enormously close friendship and mother-daughter relationship, but Richard and I made it our responsibility to always be there for them. So it gives you a strength and a closeness, I think.
Zoe's daughter Kate has always been in awe of both her mum's resilience, her wisdom and her kindness.
My mother is, well, she's everything. Given that my mum had quite a complicated childhood and quite a complicated start to life, and obviously with everything with her dad and obviously with her mother as well, who obviously also both had complicated lives. And I always say to my mum, it's like, she's amazing. She's as normal and as capable as she is, but she's just, like, I feel like being her daughter, it's the biggest privilege.
Like a brachiosaurus.
A paper brachiosaurus. Yeah. Because it's really
And perhaps Zoe's biggest fan of all is Kate's 3.5-year-old son, Jamesy.
Are they right there? And it's really?
And he is a lot of fun. And him and my mum, and my dad, of course, as well, have a very close relationship. So yeah, he really loves them a lot. He actually calls my mum Raru. That's his name for her, which actually has a Chinese connection, because the name my mum's Chinese family, particularly her dad, kind of gave to her was Rui, which I think means all you can wish for. So sometimes we would kind of call her that in front of him.
Zoe is loving being a grandparent, but it's also tinged with a bit of sadness.
Being a grandparent is wonderful, fascinating. What it does actually is it brings up for me, I've said to both my children, I feel so sorry that I didn't spend enough time with you when you were babies. Whereas with Jamesy, we see so much of him, his ups and his downs, and it's absolutely delightful. And seeing him grow and develop. So I've said to both of them, my son Simon and my daughter Kate, I feel bad that I didn't spend enough time with you. And they say, Mum, it's fine,
Despite passing away nearly 30 years ago, Joseph Needham continues to have an impact on Zoe's life. It also influenced her decision to become chair of SACU, the Society of Anglo-Chinese Understanding, of which he was one of the founding members.
I mean, obviously for me, without Joseph Needham, I certainly wouldn't be here. He met my father, brought my father to UK so my father could then meet my mother. So from our point of view, I think as a family, we've always felt, my mother used to call it a debt of gratitude to Joseph. She had a double debt in that he also supported her and helped her in my early years and remained a sort of a wise counsel for her for all his life. And I guess that's really what then triggered me to want to take over the chairing of SACU and help it become more flourishing organisation. So yeah, a very significant, essential to my life person,
In 2013, to mark the 70th anniversary of Joseph Needham's famous Chinese journey, SACU organised a special tour to retrace his footsteps. Visiting the Bailey School took Zoe back to the time when her father and Needham first met.
Somehow for me, going north of Lanzhou was quite significant. I'd stayed with family in Lanzhou and they'd been to other bits of China with me, but that real sense that this is what my father had done. And then when we were out on the Crescent Moon Lake and the camels, and that sense that, wow, these are the deserts where my father and his mate were riding the camels into, across the desert and things. That real sense of connection, and actually visiting the buildings they stayed in Dunhuan when the truck broke down and they had to hole up for a month.
Zoe's colleagues from SACU say she's made an invaluable contribution to the organisation. Here's what the organisation's vice president, librarian, historian and sinologue, Frances Wood, had to say.
Zoe is absolutely essential to SACU. She completely revived the society from a position of major depression, of not knowing where it was going and what it was doing, so that I think SACU is now working better than it has done ever, really, because we have this tremendously able administrator, someone with a real passion for what she's doing, about SACU's aims and making China better understood, creating friendship between our two countries. And Zoe is really the leader in SACU's current position.
And Rosamond Wong, SACU Membership Secretary.
Zoe is delightful. She's brought a great vision to SACU and the future of the society. I always think of her as a human dynamo.
But it's not just SACU that has benefited from Zoe's expertise. The NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, has as well. She even managed to weave the building of links with Chinese mental health hospitals into her strategy and business role.
My career has tended always towards what I call being a boundroid person, so partnership working, being on the edges. And I think my childhood and my China connection enabled me constantly to be able to think from two perspectives. So that's helped me very much in my work. I'm currently now working on a major NHS initiative to improve the access, experience and outcomes for Black citizens when they use our services, because at the moment they are more likely to have poorer access, experience and outcomes, which is a great privilege to be able to do at this point in my career, so really enjoying it.
Zoe is currently a director of the South London and Maudsley NHS Trust. She's the joint strategic lead with Dr. Jackie Dyer, who's known Zoe for over 20 years and says that Zoe has done a great deal to support inclusion and diversity.
I couldn't achieve what it is that I do in terms of mental health service improvement without Zoe being a key player walking alongside me in this very difficult work. I think because Zoe has a lived experience of adversities and challenges throughout her life journey, I think that she brings a compassion and understanding of the complexities of the human experience into her work.
And although Zoe has a very busy work and family life, she always makes time for her friends too. And they've been a tremendous source of strength to her during difficult times, such as when her parents passed away. Here's one of her best pals.
My name is Diane, and I have been a friend of Zoe's for over 40 years. And you can imagine during that period we might have fallen out a few times, but actually, I don't think we have. But we have tried to help and support each other in times of need, and we're also capable of having a very good time too. And Zoe's brilliant at shopping, so there's nothing better than going out shopping with Zoe, and she can cope with all that as well as all her work and any other issues that are going on, and she's my go-to friend all the time. She is very bubbly, she's small, and I think we small people really like to make an impression and think we want people to know we are here in a nice way, because being small you do tend to think that the rest of the world wants to just pat you on the head and ignore you. But Zoe, and I like to think myself as well, I mean, we're not those sort of people. We are part of whatever we're involved in, and we will make ourselves heard.
Despite all the obstacles Zoe has encountered in her life, she is definitely a glass-half-full person, tenacious, considerate, and always trying to make a difference to those around her.
I'm a creature who lives in the current and the future, so I don't particularly dwell on the past, and I think that's probably born out of my life experiences. I always see new possibilities, and I always see new connections and see positive ways forward, myself and the world.
As a bridge builder between China and the UK, I asked Zoe what her final thoughts were.
My message to everybody really is that we've really got to learn to listen and respect one another, and that way we'll get understanding. We do have to accept in this technological world it's kind of pretty hard to know what is the truth about most things. So we have got to try and positively seek out different perspectives to try and get a rounded picture on things, and then to realise that we're all humans in China and in Britain, and we can use our human to people connection to build that friendship and understanding.
And with young ambassadors like Jamesy, Zoe's grandson in the UK, and her niece's daughter Yu Yu in China, it seems there's reason to be optimistic about the future.
姨姥姥你好，我是月月。Hello Zoe, welcome to China and go my home.
You've been listening to Bridge Builders with me, Louise Greenwood. The producer was Sarah Parfitt, the series producer was Elizabeth Menz, and the chief editor was Gua Shan.